And welcome everyone to today's Association for Manufacturing Excellence webinar titled Reaching Compliance. I am Jerry Strohmeyer, the Education and Training Program Coordinator for AME, and I will be your moderator. Today's presenter is John Wagner, the Director of Materials Management for the Association of Equipment Manufacturers. We are excited to have John present these compliance materials to you today to provide an increased awareness on the current regulatory issues of EU REACH, the European Union regulation on the registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals, EU RoHS, the European Union restriction of hazardous substances, and conflict minerals. John has over 25 years of experience in the agricultural and construction industries. He oversees the Association of Equipment Manufacturers' efforts to address the environmental regulatory compliance issues that impact our industries globally. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. You will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. You will see that you are muted on your attendee panel on the right side of your screen. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into your question area in the attendee panel and click on Submit. We'll review the questions at the end of today's presentation and answer as many as we can. When you log off today, please check your email inbox, and it will be an invitation and link to fill out a short webinar attendee survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey today, as your feedback is very important to us to improve future webinars. John has also graciously agreed to provide a PDF of today's presentation. We will be sending that along with a recorded link for a webinar replay to each of you next week. Now I am pleased to introduce John Wagner, who will present Reaching Compliance. Take it away, John.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here today to speak to the group regarding these important regulatory issues and how they impact us and how they can impact our business, especially with regard to market access. The overview of what we're going to talk to today, I'm going to give you a little background on AEM, our involvement in regulatory compliance, and then we'll talk about specific issues with regard to conflict minerals, EU REACH, EU RoHS, and talk about the similarities of the issues and basically summarize what's going on. So AEM, the Association of Equipment Manufacturers, is over 100 years old as a industry association, and it began with the construction and the agriculture industries. We also cover the mining industry, the forestry industry, and the utility industry. So we have 850 plus member organizations. They include people that you might have heard of like Caterpillar, Terex, John Deere, and some that you may not have heard of like Aztec, Gomeco, Red Dot. But all of them are involved with those industries that we talk about, and what we as an industry association are all about is helping them to maintain market access, and really that's how we came to be involved in regulatory compliance. Not too long ago, there was a cross-industry group that asked us to develop an industry approach to regulatory compliance management, because these companies, and they are as divergent as Boeing, Seagate, Bosch, Caterpillar, John Deere, Toro, they all have the same challenge, and that is to collect the data for all these different regulatory issues and to be able to keep it straight, to be able to, they're asking for the same information, and they share a lot of the tier 1 suppliers, and therefore they're asking the same questions of people over and over, and it's become a challenge, and there really needs to be an industry approach. So they asked us at AEM to look into one, and in doing so, our board approved that we attack this by providing an ongoing source of regulatory intelligence, creating some regulatory compliance training, developing a method to distribute and track training through the supply chain, and lead the effort in identifying an industry-wide common data format and exchange system. That's how our approach to it and how we've been going about it. But more importantly, we need to talk about some of the background on regulations that AEM is addressing. So conflict minerals is a regulation that we're going to talk about. It has to do with natural resources extracted from conflict zones. We'll talk more specifically about that in a little bit. It is a U.S. driven legislation and required of companies that are publicly traded companies to report as part of their SEC filings. And we're coming up on the date when those filings are due. REACH is a European regulation that is one of the biggest regulations that's ever been put together. It's 847 pages long. It addresses a lot of hazardous chemicals, and it's a very dynamic regulation in that every 6 months there are changes that occur to it, which we'll talk to in a little bit. And the third one that we're going to talk about is RoHS, the restriction of hazardous substances. It's been around for a while. It started with 6 chemicals, mostly in the area of electrical and electronic equipment, but it is changing as well. So we're going to talk about those 3 and the impacts that they have and some of the changes that have occurred with them recently. So we're going to start with conflict minerals. Conflict minerals is the most pressing of the 3 regulations for U.S. companies, because if you are, it was part of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Consumer Protection Law, and it impacts all SEC filers in your supply chains, and it covers 4 materials: tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold, sometimes referred to as 3TNG, and the one that are necessary for production and function of products. And it says here something called no de minimis, and what that means is if there's no minimal amount, if it shows up in your product and it's necessary for production and function of the product, it needs to be reported on. And it requires data from your entire supply chain, and that means going all the way back to the mine, theoretically, and the smelter, and so forth. So where in a product would you find tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold? This is an example of one of our construction equipment pieces, and the areas and the stars there indicate areas on the machine where you might find these. And in essence, electronics, in the electronics you can find tin in your solder, tantalum in your components, and gold in coatings. In the ripper tips, the tips that actually contact the ground, you can find tungsten in the hardening process. There are a lot of seals on these vehicles, and you'll find tungsten in the metal face seals, and gold and tungsten are possibly used as a catalyst for the torque rings and seals. In the power transmission area, you're going to find a lot of tin in the gray ductile iron castings. You'll find tin in plain bearings, tin in roller bearings, tin and tantalum and gold in the electronics. In the hydraulic systems, you're going to find tin in the bearings and coatings of the pumps and motors. You're going to find tin in the bronze coatings of the hose wires. You're going to find tin in the braze alloys, in the oil cooler solders, and gold and tungsten are possible as catalysts for the accumulator bladder. Let me go back here just a second. So what you find is that it is everywhere throughout the product. And so the challenge then you can see is not only identifying where it can be, but then finding where did it come from beyond that. If we look at even a smaller portion of that, just an engine itself, you can find tin in the bearings, you can find it in the ductile iron, you can find it in the tin and tungsten in the piston rings, you can find it in the iron cylinder liners, tungsten in the valve guides and the seat coatings, tin in the valve guides and tin in the solders and brazes that are used to connect a lot of the different pieces. So bottom line, they're throughout our products, and not only do we need to know where they are, but we need to start accumulating the information and reporting it. So most companies are requesting, if you've had a request for a conflict minerals report, they would expect you to most likely report it given the conflict minerals reporting template. This comes from a group called the Conflict Free Sourcing Initiative, and that group puts this out and has become almost a standard document. And so you'll receive a survey from your OEM. They'll be asking you to provide answers and put them into this format. And the conflict minerals questions are very specific, and you need to be very careful about how you answer those. We have some training that we've developed on that allows you to study this closer, but that's how they are reported, is through the CMRT. So the latest developments around this is that a U.S. appellate court has agreed to review a previous decision striking down requirements of companies to declare that their products are not DRC conflict free if they could not prove otherwise. And this is called a name and shame provision. So basically what they were trying to do is, if you couldn't prove that you are DRC conflict free, they wanted you to hold up your hand and say, we're not conflict free. And so people are challenging that because of the difficulty of being able to actually determine where did this come from. And there are many reasons around that, but that's a development. So it's if that goes away, then a lot of the sting early on of having to say I'm not conflict free just because we couldn't quite prove otherwise is going to go away. It does not remove the requirement for us to continue to find out if we are and to track back through the supply chain, but it is a little less onerous with that happening. Also, there's a group out there called CFSI, the Conflict Free Smelter Initiative. We've talked about them. They have about 200 companies and 7 different associations that go together and provide funding to be able to go out and actually physically verify and audit that smelters are conflict free. So out of the 300 to 400 smelters out there, several years ago we had 40 that had been audited and verified. By the end of 2015, the estimate is to have 160 of those. So that good work allows us to not have to go all the way back through the smelter to the mine, but to start at a smelter and move forward. That is very good work that's being done and continues to be done. And if you are not currently a member of the Conflict Free Smelter Initiative and you are a reporting company, you may want to consider joining that association and help fund that effort. So when we start talking about companies and how are they dealing with this, there was a group called ERA out of Europe that did a survey at one of their seminars to ask the question, have you started asking suppliers about conflict minerals in their products? In December of 2012, about 22% had already begun to ask that question. If you look at those that said yes and didn't know if they used the CMRT, so you can see that, and those that say yes and the CMRT not used, about 50% of companies were already asking people for the information. And of that, 22% were actually using the CMRT. That has grown year over year. In December, they did the same program in December 2013, and that had now risen to about 40%, and we're about 45% of the people are using the conflict mineral reporting template. But also you'll notice that about 80% of companies are asking for that information. So it is becoming more prevalent as we go, and the CMRT continues to be the reporting template of choice. Well, what's next for conflict minerals? Conflict minerals has a June 1st reporting deadline for the year of 2014. So companies have been collecting the information. They are currently in the process of evaluating that and filling out their information that needs to be delivered to the SEC, which they'll be doing that in the June 1st timeframe, in other words, just a month from now. The 2016 reporting deadline, I don't know, will no longer be an acceptable answer, so that is pushing a lot of increased pressure on the implementation of what's called due diligence process from the OECD, where what they're saying is you need to be able to demonstrate compliance, you need to build relationships with your suppliers, and you need to validate marketing claims and opportunities, all of which add further burdens on the companies, especially since you have a relationship with your tier 1 supplier directly, but you may not with any ones below that. In fact, it is likely that you don't have a relationship with the tier 2 supplier because of the, in essence, the proprietary nature of the supply chain's identity. Your supplier doesn't necessarily want you to know who they buy their products from, and you don't necessarily want to know either. But in this process, and what is being expected is that we get information that penetrates the supply chain. In our industry, and I can speak to it more directly, our average supply chain is 11 layers deep. So you're being asked to track that through that supply chain 11 layers before you get to a smelter. So that's a long chain, and of which you don't have a lot of control. So it's a challenge, and it's something that requires buy-in and for people to participate. In the longer term, more companies are using that CMRT and that requirement to strengthen their relationships with their suppliers. We're seeing a lot of companies have a conflict minerals statement. That's part of the due diligence, is that they have a statement about their how they view conflict minerals, and their expectation that that information is being supplied as part of the disclosure of the materials that are used in the processes of putting together the products that they're receiving. So in essence, we're seeing a drive towards, you're not just buying the product, you're buying all the information about the product and what's in it, where did it come from, as part of that process. And more these regulatory issues and the data needed are becoming part of the terms and conditions, and they're becoming part of the PPAP, or the purchase parts acceptance policy. So ultimately, conflict minerals is becoming a little more prevalent, and we're in the 3rd year into it, and you can expect further scrutiny on it. As an aside, you need to make sure that if you're being requested for conflict minerals information, even though you may not be required to report directly to the SEC, it is increasingly becoming a business imperative that you do supply the information to the person that is buying the equipment from you. One last thing about conflict minerals in the future, the European Union is considering, and most likely by the end of this year will have their own conflict minerals law. There's some major differences from the U.S. It's going to be a voluntary program. It's not going to be limited to the DRC region, which is in Central Africa, And the responsibilities are going to be on the EU importers. So if you're importing into Europe, they're going to be expecting you to voluntarily work with this program. Eventually, it may become required, but in the beginning, it's going to be a voluntary program. It's currently being debated. There's a great deal of difference between how the law is and debate about how it should be implemented, but that all should come more clear in mid-year to third quarter of this year. You can look for an EU conflict mineral law to be delivered. So while we're talking about the EU, let's go into the REACH law. REACH is really the most comprehensive law and regulation that has come about. It's called an extended producer responsibility regulation. What that means is that you as a company are responsible for proving that your product is safe and providing the information for its safety. And if it has some substances in it that are not safe or have been identified as substances of very high concern, you need to report on them if they are reach a certain level of content in your products. This law replaced 40 other laws, and it requires the registration of thousands of chemicals. That's been going on for the past 10, 15 years, the registration of those chemicals, and it requires a very technical dossier to be turned in on each one of those registered substances, and that kind of thing has been going on for quite some time now. But the area that you as a manufacturer need to be aware of is that there are 3 lists that, they're changing lists, but there are 3 main lists that you need to be aware of that have those SVHCs on them. The first one is called the Substances of Very High Concern Candidate List for authorization. It currently has 155 substances on it, and by law, new substances can be added twice a year. So usually in June and in December, new chemicals can be added to that list. The second list is called the authorization list, and that's actually a subset of the candidate list. So of those 155 substances, there are 44 of them that are on the candidate list. And what that means is they're a candidate for authorization. So in other words, if it makes it to the candidate for authorization list, then those can only be in a product made in the EU if they have been authorized for a specific use. And I'll give you an example. There's something called DEHP. It's a plasticizer. What it does is it adds strength and flexibility in PVC, in rubber products, in other items, but it is on the authorization list. And if you are a producer inside of Europe and you were using DEHP in some of your PVC products, as of February of this year, you are no longer able to put products on the market that have DEHP in them. However, it does not limit or does not restrict them from products being imported in. So if you're getting pieces in from outside of Europe, if it has DEHP in it, and that DEHP goes over the limit of 0.1% weight for weight, it needs to be declared as it comes in. So, so the idea is that number one, you need to be aware of what's on the list, and you need to be and what's in your product, and compare those two, because it brings about very strict reporting requirements. The third list is called the REACH restrictions list, and this came from a lot of those 40 laws that it was combining, and it includes a lot of substances that that were already identified as being very very harmful. There are 105 substances on this list. There are thousands of compounds, and the important thing to understand is if a substance on the restriction list is in the product, it cannot legally be placed on the EU market. So you need to be aware of those as you're moving forward. This is also known as the Annex 17 list. So keep that in mind. But those three lists are available online. You can get them at the REACH or the European Chemical Agency site and be able to monitor them as you go forward. Biggest changes? Well, one of the biggest change that's happened is that in Europe, when you have the end-of-life vehicle, it was all about a homogeneous material. So anything in the material that was pervasive in the product, the same with RoHS. But in REACH, it's being the basis of compliance is called an article. So a spare part can be an article because it exists on its own, or if you go back to that picture we had of the bulldozer, an entire bulldozer can be considered an article. And that's the way it's been looked at right now. And what that means is that if you do the math and understand how much metal, because SVHCs don't usually end up being present in metals, versus all the other parts and pieces that make up a tractor or a crane or an excavator, and you do the math, what you can show almost mathematically is that you couldn't have enough SVHCs available to be able to reach that level of reporting. However, that's all changing with what's called the once an article, always an article. What that means is that if you have a hose that has that as a spare part was being considered an article, it's a standalone. That article, that piece, needs to be reported on as part of the tractor or the bigger article. So what that means is that the process of doing that math exercise no longer works. You need to understand the makeup of each one of the parts individually and be able to report on those individual parts. And if there happens to be a PVC piece on there that has DEHP in it at a reportable level, then you have to report on that, and it's no longer that PVC as a part of the entire machine. So now you're at risk of having one piece that is reportable that you need to make sure that you have that information. And what that does is it places a much higher level of importance on collecting data on a part-by-part basis. So the Court of Justice, when they take this into account, because it says here that the Advocate General has made they've made a recommendation that once an article, always an article be the implementation level. And that is important to understand because the Advocate General, when they make these recommendations to the European Court of Justice, they almost always get accepted. So what that means is that we really need to look at something called full material disclosure. In essence, for every part and piece on a machine, we need to know where does it come from, what's in it, in what concentration, how is it being used, what was the process that it was put on with, and how is it being used coming out of that. So if you can answer those questions, you can be able to say whether or not you're compliant. Which then brings us to European RoHS. RoHS is the Registration of Hazardous Substances. It started in 2003. Originally, it had to do with electrical and electrical equipment. There were 6 substances that they were looking at, 4 very heavy metals, lead, cadmium, mercury, and hexchromium, very nasty stuff, and 2 polybrominated flame retardants. And then the basis of compliance was any homogeneous material in a product at 0.1% except for cadmium, which was at 1/100%. So that was the original target, and that's what they've been doing. It impacts all the electrical and electronic components in products within scope. And originally in scope, at least for our industry, a lot of the equipment had been excluded. But in 2010, there was something came out called RoHS 2 or RoHS Recast. And in doing so, it says that that it changed the way that things were being read, and certain non-road mobile machinery would be included in the directive, and there's a lot of confusion around that right now. And what our industry is going through is we're looking at this detailed study that the EU did, which is dealing with some of the complex issues and the recommendations to the Commission and future resolutions. But it has a lot to do with what is onboard versus external power. What are, there are some inconsistencies with the non-road mobile machinery directive, and what is a fixed installation and what's a mobile installation. So the bottom line is there's still a lot of interpretation going on about what does this really mean to our industry. But more importantly, they have added 4 new substances to the RoHS original 6. And look at this, we see that chemical DEHP come up again. Well, what we've found out is that since DEHP became part of the candidate list, we've also found out that it is not only was it harmful to human reproduction, but it is now also identified as an endocrine disruptor, which is a very, very nasty thing. So it's been identified that these items, which are now typically found in circuit packages, integrated circuits, capacitors, resistors, molded plastic adhesives, paints, and resins, that they should be phased out completely by 2019. We need to document them now, but they must be removed by 2019 out of those products. So again, this shows that there's an overlap between the different regulations, and that some of these chemicals have been identified as nasty in many different areas. So something to definitely understand and be on top of. So with that, let's talk about some of the similarities between these different 3 very different regulations. So how did we get here? What does it mean for our industry? And how does it impact the design and manufacture of our products? And where does accurate data come from? Very important things to understand. So regulatory regulations have been around in this area since 2003. That's when RoHS 1 was enacted. REACH was enacted in 2006, and they started collecting the data on the various different substances. In 2010, conflict minerals was enacted, and in 2011, RoHS 2 has been enacted. But you can see the steady increase of regulations globally, and that curve has not slowed down any and continues to grow. So what does it mean for us? Well, they place responsibility for the products on the safety of the OEMs. Each one of these does. They target substances in the products. They spread quickly across markets and industries. For instance, the REACH regulations, while they're coming out of Europe, are also now similar. What's called Korean REACH, China REACH, Turkey, and other areas of the world are embracing those and coming up with their own version of those areas and those particular regulations. And compliance requires a great deal of substance data. As you can see, and as we've talked through this, you need to know a lot more about your product than we ever did in the past. And so companies must now identify and document and report substances and products, and that begins with the engineering area when we start to specify products and how they're put together, we need to know processes. We need to know does that plating process include hex chrome? All those sorts of issues need to be in consideration as you're going through the whole process from engineering design through shipment to your end users. So how does it impact the design and manufacture? Well, what substances are in your products and in what concentrations? How are they used? Where did they come from? Where were they processed and how were they processed? And answering this, again, requires a great deal of substance data that you need to be collecting as a matter of course. Where does it come from? Well, you have to ask for it down through the supply chain. Our supply chains in our industries, in the industries that we've seen, like electronics, they typically go about 4 levels deep. In the automotive, they go 6 to 8 levels deep. In our industry, they go down 11 layers on average. And then you get to the smelter and the mine. But by using a due diligence process, you have to, what we're looking for is complete, accurate, traceable, and updatable information. And there are processes that you can put in place to be able to help facilitate that process. So in summary, what's AEM doing to help the industry? Well, we're ensuring companies have the knowledge and skills to manage regulatory compliance through internal training of your own employees to help them understand the process. Keeping on top of the regulatory changes with monthly updates. We have a regulated substances brief that is available to keep on top of REACH, RoHS, conflict minerals, and other current issues. And ensuring that the supply chain has the knowledge and skills to manage the regulatory compliance. Again, the same training that's available to you and your company is available through the supply chain through a unique learning management system that we've put together. And finally, how do we simplify the data exchange with an industry-endorsed system and format? And we're working very hand-in-hand with not only our industry, but the aeronautics industry, the plastics industry, the electronics industry, to put together a workable process to ensure that we can take the complexity, some of the complexity out, and allow us to take that time saved from having the complexity of reporting in multiple different formats and use it to create good, solid, reportable, repeatable, traceable information throughout the supply chain. So the key takeaways that I hope you bring home with you today are that environmental regulations are increasing, they're here to stay, that compliance requires us to collect a great deal of substance data and keep it available so that we can pass it on, and that AEM has some solutions that we're working on, not only for our industry, but for other industries, to be able to to make this a workable solution. With that being said, I'm ready to take any questions and comments that you might have at this time.
Okay, thank you, and we'll review any questions. If you do have any questions for John, please submit them on the right side of your screen and I'll read them.
While you're thinking about that, this is a very, very dense amount of information that we've given you. It is something that takes a bit of thinking about, and I'm sure that is going to be part of a lot of people's responsibilities going forward. And if you have comments or questions, I would certainly entertain those.
Great, thanks. We have a question. Since our company does not sell into Europe, does the EU reach impact us?
Well, if your company does not sell directly into Europe, you may not have to deal with EU reach, but if you are selling parts or to people who do, if you're part of the supply chain and you're selling to a company that does sell into Europe, you can expect that they're going to require you to provide the information needed to show that they are REACH compliant. So the answer is maybe. It just depends on are you making and selling your products exclusively in the U.S., then the answer is no, it doesn't apply to you. If you're selling units that are becoming part of something bigger that's being sold into Europe by another company, then the answer is you're probably going to be required to provide that information so that they can show that they are REACH compliant.
Okay, thank you. Is RoHS just for selling electronics shipped into Europe?
You know, it used to be that it was mainly electronics and electronic pieces, but with the RoHS recast, it's actually expanded beyond the electronics. The way it's written is if you're selling consumer products into Europe, something that can be used by a consumer, that every part and piece of that, not just the electronics, but every part and piece of it has to be proven to be RoHS compliant. And you can see by some of the items that they've added with the DEHP and some of the other phthalates that all are part of plastic pieces, it expands well beyond just the electronics. So it's something that if you sell consumer products into Europe, you may want to look very closely at RoHS compliance.
Okay, thank you. And we have another one. Does a private company need to report on conflict minerals?
That's a good question, and we get that a lot. I'm a private company. I don't have SEC reporting responsibilities. Do I have to report on conflict minerals? And the answer is no, if that's all that you are. If you are a privately held company, if you're selling your products to the public, you're not selling them to other companies, then you probably have no conflict minerals reporting requirement. However, if you are a privately held company and someone that you are supplying is a larger company or a company that has reporting responsibilities, you may have while you won't have a legal obligation, you may have a business obligation to report on conflict minerals to them to facilitate their ability to report to the SEC and have all the information that they need. So again, it just depends on your situation, and with a lot of these, what we're really seeing going forward is this, that we're going to need to understand what's in our products, where did they come from, and in what concentration, how are they used, what were the processes that were used on them, because in order to do that, now we understand more about everything that goes into our products. One example of that is a couple of years ago, some manufacturers had facilities that were manufacturing things for them in the Pacific Rim, and there was the tsunami, and it took out a lot of the sources of their products and hurt their supply chains. Well, and we're seeing some examples of that today. If you look on the news and you see that in Nepal there was the earthquake, if you had any sources of materials from Nepal At this point, you may want to know, number one, do we have any there? And number two, do we have any alternative sources to make sure that we don't have an interruption in our business? And the same with Peru, with what's going on down there with the eruption of the volcano. Do we have any sources of global sources that were down there in that area that might be impacted, and can we source them differently? And also other geopolitical things can happen that could impact our business. It's just becoming very, very important that we know and understand what's in our products on a much more granular level than we ever did before to ensure that our business is sustainable moving forward.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's it on questions. So thank you, John, for your responses, and thank you, everyone, for your questions. And thank you, John, for a very informative presentation. This brings our webinar to a close. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, May 14th, titled How to Sustain Your 5S Improvements with David Visco. Please visit ame.org under the AME Events and Training tab for more information and to register. And don't forget to fill out the short survey that will be in your inbox. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a productive day.